This documentary explores the rise and fall of one of the most powerful political systems of the 20th century, the Soviet Union. For more than 70 years, the Soviet states shaped global politics, influenced wars, inspired revolutions, and challenged the balance of power across the world. Its story begins with revolution and ends with collapse. To understand this transformation, we must begin in the year 1917. At that time, the Russian Empire was already under enormous pressure. Years of war, economic hardship, and political instability had weakened the old system. The First World War placed immense strain on the country's resources and morale. In this environment, revolutionary movements gained strength. Among them was a political group known as the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin believed that the existing political structure could not be reformed. Instead, he argued that it had to be completely replaced by a new system based on socialist principles. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. This event became known as the October Revolution. The revolution marked the beginning of a new political experiment. Soon after taking power, Lenin and the Bolsheviks began reorganizing the state. Industries were nationalized, land was redistributed, and political opposition was suppressed. However, the new government faced immediate resistance. A brutal civil war broke out between the Bolsheviks and their opponents. The conflict lasted from 1918 to 1921 and caused widespread destruction across the country. When the war ended, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious. In 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union, was officially formed. The early Soviet state faced enormous challenges. The economy was devastated, infrastructure was damaged, and political tensions remained high. Lenin introduced a temporary economic reform known as the New Economic Policy, allowing limited private trade in order to stabilize the country. But Lenin's time in power did not last long. After his death in 1924, a struggle for leadership began inside the Communist Party. Eventually, Joseph Stalin emerged as the dominant figure. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union entered a period of rapid and dramatic transformation. Industrialization became the central goal of the government. Massive factories were built, railways expanded, and large-scale economic plans were introduced. At the same time, agriculture was reorganized through collectivization. These policies aimed to modernize the Soviet economy and strengthen the state. However, the transformation came at an enormous human cost. Millions of people were affected by political repression, forced labor systems, and economic disruption. Despite these hardships, the Soviet Union rapidly developed into a major industrial power. This industrial capacity would soon play a crucial role in the Second World War. In 1941, Nazi Germany launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The conflict became one of the most destructive battles in human history. Cities were destroyed, entire regions were devastated, and millions of lives were lost. Yet the Soviet Union ultimately managed to repel the invasion. The victory in 1945 elevated the Soviet Union to the status of a global superpower. After the war, a new international rivalry emerged. The Soviet Union and the United States became the two dominant powers of the Cold War. This period was defined by ideological competition, military buildup, and global influence. Nuclear weapons, space exploration, and political alliances all became part of this strategic rivalry. Inside the Soviet Union, leadership continued to change. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev introduced a series of reforms. He attempted to reduce political repression and modernize parts of the system. However, the Soviet structure remained highly centralized and controlled. Later leaders such as Leonid Brezhnev maintained stability but struggled to address deeper economic problems. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet system began showing clear signs of stagnation. Economic growth slowed, technological development lagged behind Western countries. Administrative bureaucracy grew larger and less flexible. These problems created increasing pressure for reform. In 1985, a new leader came to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet system required major changes in order to survive. He introduced two major reform programs. The first was perestroika, meaning economic restructuring. The second was glasnost, meaning political openness. These reforms aimed to modernize the economy and increase transparency within the government. However, Reforming such a large and complex system proved extremely difficult. Greater openness allowed people to express criticism that had previously been suppressed. Economic restructuring created instability before improvements could take effect. At the same time, nationalist movements began gaining strength within several Soviet republics. These pressures gradually weakened the central authority of the Soviet government. By the early 1990s, the system was under severe strain. In 1991, a political crisis erupted after a failed attempt by hardline officials to stop the reform process. The event further weakened the Soviet leadership. Later that same year, several republics declared independence. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. A political system that had lasted nearly 70 years came to an end. The rise and fall of Soviet power remains one of the most significant historical transformations of the modern era. It reshaped global politics, influenced ideological debates, and left a lasting legacy across many regions of the world. Understanding this history is essential for understanding the 20th century itself, because the story of the Soviet Union is not only about a state, it is also about ideas, systems, leadership, and the challenges of governing a vast and complex society. Welcome back to our journey through the history of the Soviet Union. In our last episode, we saw the USSR at the peak of its power, a global superpower locked in a tense standoff with the West. But behind the Iron Curtain, the seeds of change were already being sown. By the 1980s, the Soviet giant was beginning to stumble. The planned economy, once a symbol of industrial might, was now a source of chronic shortages. Store shelves were often empty, and people waited in long lines for basic necessities. The war in Afghanistan, which began in 1979, had become a costly and demoralizing quagmire, often called the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The system was stagnating, and a deep sense of cynicism had settled over the population. In 1985, a new, younger leader came to power. Mikhail Gorbachev. He recognized the urgent need for reform. He introduced revolutionary policies: glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. Glasnost allowed for greater freedom of speech and the press. For the first time in decades, citizens could openly criticize the government and discuss taboo subjects like the Stalinist newspapers and television buzzed with newfound energy and debate. It was a breath of fresh air for a society long suffocated by censorship. Perestroika aimed to restructure the economy, introducing elements of market-like reforms and allowing for some private enterprise. The goal was to revitalize the stagnant system without completely dismantling it. But these reforms had unintended consequences. Glasnost didn't just allow for criticism. It unleashed a tidal wave of long-suppressed national identities and grievances. Across the 15 republics that made up the USSR, from the Baltics to Central Asia, people began to demand more autonomy, and eventually, full independence. The economic reforms of perestroika were too little, too late. They disrupted the old system without effectively creating a new one, leading to even more economic chaos and instability. Shortages worsened, and inflation soared. Instead of saving the Soviet Union, Gorbachev's reforms were accelerating its unraveling. The year 1989 was a turning point. One by one, the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, long held in the Soviet sphere of influence, collapsed. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 was a powerful symbol that the old order was crumbling. The Soviet Union, weakened by its internal problems, did not intervene. This sent a clear signal to the republics within the USSR that Moscow's grip was failing. Lithuania declared independence in 1990, followed by other republics. The political landscape was shifting rapidly. A charismatic and populist politician named Boris Yeltsin emerged as a powerful rival to Gorbachev, championing Russian sovereignty and more radical reforms. The final act came in August 1991. A group of hardline communist officials, desperate to halt the reforms and preserve the Soviet Union, launched a coup. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest and declared a state of emergency. But the coup was poorly organized and met with massive public resistance. In Moscow, thousands of citizens, led by Boris Yeltsin, rallied to defend their newfound freedoms. Yeltsin famously stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament building, defying the coup plotters. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed. It was a fatal blow to the authority of the Communist Party and the Central Soviet government. In the wake of the failed coup, The process of dissolution became unstoppable. Republic after republic declared its independence. Gorbachev, his power completely eroded, was left as the president of a country that no longer existed. On Christmas Day, December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. That evening, the red Soviet flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, and the tricolor flag of the new Russian Federation was raised in its place. After nearly 70 years, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had officially ceased to exist. The collapse of the Soviet Union sent shockwaves across the globe, ending the Cold War and reshaping the international order. For the people who lived through it, the 1990s were a time of tumultuous change, often called the Wild 90s. The transition to market economies was brutal. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. State-owned industries collapsed, leading to mass unemployment, and a new class of oligarchs amassed immense wealth, while millions were plunged into poverty. Life expectancy dropped, and crime rates soared. It was a period of profound social and economic trauma. But it was also a time of newfound freedom and opportunity. People could travel, start businesses, and express themselves in ways that had been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The legacy of the Soviet Union is complex and continues to shape our world today. It left behind a legacy of industrialization and scientific achievement, including the space race, but also a legacy of political repression, environmental disasters like Chernobyl, and deep-seated ethnic conflicts that have re-emerged in places like Ukraine and the Caucasus. For Russia and the other former Soviet republics, the past is a constant presence, influencing their politics, culture, and national identity. Understanding this history is not just about looking back. It's essential for understanding the geopolitical landscape of the 21st century. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the story of the Soviet Union. It's a vast and fascinating subject, and we've only scratched the surface. What part of this history do you find most compelling? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this series, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next historical documentary. Thanks for watching.